So when it started to become obvious around mid-March that most businesses would have to shut down, there was a lot of fear that small businesses wouldn't survive this. Because how were independent shops and restaurants going to pay their rent and keep paying employees if there were no customers coming in and no one was buying anything? But since then, the government has introduced a bunch of programs meant to keep small businesses afloat, like a wage subsidy program, an emergency loan, and a rent relief program. And a lot of businesses have applied for all of these things. And now there's talk of reopening, so we thought it was a good time to check in. 9 weeks into the lockdown, how are small businesses doing? And is the help that they're getting from the government enough to help them get through this? Vanmala Subramaniam is back on the show today. She's a business reporter at the Financial Post. She's been tracking 3 companies since the beginning, and she has a lot of insight into where things might be headed. I'm Tamara Kandaker, and you're listening to Wait, There's More. Hey, Van, welcome back.
Hi. Thanks for having me again, Tamara.
So we're not talking about weed today, and people will be disappointed. We're talking about small businesses, which is actually really interesting. So you've been following 3 small businesses since April. Briefly tell me a little bit about them and how they were doing at the time when you first talked to them. This was, I think, a couple of weeks into the economic shutdown.
Right. So in early April, I got in touch with 3 different kinds of small businesses. Just to give you a sense, small businesses are technically defined as businesses that hire under 100 employees. So the first business I spoke to in April was this independent retailer selling clothes, shoes, accessories out in Alberta called Poppy Barley.
This is our ready or not flat, if it's true to size. This style has a slightly higher front vamp.
And they have 2 brick and mortar stores in malls, one in Edmonton and one in Calgary. And so when I spoke to them, they had been shut down for 2 weeks and they had lost 90% of their revenue very, very suddenly. And so they really, really took a hit.
So Poppy Barley started out with a staff of 50 people, but when they shut their stores, no one was really buying stuff online, and they were forced to reduce their staff to 14 people through layoffs and attrition.
And then I decided to also kind of look at a bigger business. So I spoke to this car dealership owner.
The owner's name is Michael Carmichael, and he runs a company called Up Auto.
His family has been owning car dealerships for generations, actually, and he hires over 50 employees, has 4 dealerships across Ontario, and people stopped coming to dealerships, so he had to let a lot of his staff go. He first let about 50% of staff go, and he closed 2 of the 4 locations. There was very little foot traffic. Obviously, people were not allowed to leave their homes, so they couldn't go in to buy cars. And, people were not really in the mood to buy cars because they were worried about their jobs. So all those things were happening.
In the first 2 weeks of March, Up Auto saw their revenues go down by about 15%. So not that bad. But after that, their revenues really plummeted, which Van is going to talk about later.
And the third business I profiled was this little digital marketing company in Toronto called Imprint Marketing. So the kind of stuff they did was they basically helped businesses build brands, do their social media, those kinds of things.
At Imprint, we build website solutions that integrate your business's existing inventory setups into new and effective point-of-sale systems.
They saw their revenue deplete by about 40%, and it's because their existing clients were also suffering, and the first things their clients decided to cut were marketing budgets. So that's why this company, Imprint Marketing, got affected. So they had to lay off 30% of their staff. At the time, they were hoping to retain the remaining 7 employees they had.
Okay, so we've talked about these 3 businesses in particular, but in general, can you talk a bit about how small businesses have been hit by this pandemic? What are the challenges that they're facing that are sort of unique to them?
Absolutely. So the thing to remember about small businesses is they tend to operate with not a lot of financial runway. And when I say that, I mean that in normal circumstances, they're not really able to weather, sudden economic recessions for more than a couple of months. And just to give you a sense of that, the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses does these surveys every week. And on their recent survey, they found out that 45% of small businesses have seen their revenues drop by 70% or more. And that was in the first week of May. So that's huge, right? So you're thinking about almost half of small businesses in this country have had their revenues wiped out by more than 40%. And most small businesses, so, close to 80% of small businesses have seen their revenues drop 30% or more. And in a normal time, when a small business kind of goes through a revenue drop of 30% or more, they have to start laying off staff, or they have to consider, somehow getting a loan, resizing their business, refiguring out their operations. They cannot take revenue drops of even that magnitude. And so you can imagine right now we're into week 9 of the pandemic. Most small businesses in the country are shut. Only 22% of small businesses are fully open. And so, if this goes on, it's going to get really bad for them.
So in April, the federal government started rolling out programs to help small businesses. And I'm going to go through them very quickly before we get into how all of this is playing out. So the big one that's supposed to help companies prevent layoffs is the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. The government will cover up to 75% of a person's wages up to a certain amount, and that amount is $847. Companies are eligible for that program if they lost 15% of their revenue in March or 30% in the months before or after that.
Our hope is that employers who are being pushed towards laying off people because of COVID-19 will think again.
The government's also rolled out a bunch of small business loans that companies can apply for, and the big one is the Canada Emergency Business Account. This is a $40,000 interest-free loan that any business can apply for, doesn't have any interest on it, and you don't have to pay it back immediately, but it's a loan.
And if you repay it within 2 years, 25%, up to $10,000 of that loan is forgivable.
And the third big assistance program that the government introduced was a rent relief program for businesses, also known as CECRA. And under this program, the landlord would give the business a 25% discount on rent, the government would cover 50% of the rent, and the business would have to pay the remaining 25%.
The idea behind it was a shared burden. The government felt that it was important that landlords also share the burden of the crisis, and it wasn't just incumbent upon tenants to cover, 50% of the rent or have their rent deferred but still owe it a few months later.
Okay, so we have the wage subsidy program, we have these emergency loans that are introduced, and then this rent relief program for businesses. And you followed up with these 3 companies that we talked about at the beginning recently, and what's happened to them since then? How have they had to change the way that they do things, and have things gotten any better with the help of these programs that we just talked about?
Yeah, so I found Poppy Barley, the retailer out in Alberta. They've had a really interesting 4 weeks since I first spoke to them in April. So they said that actually been a rebound in consumer spending on their website. So in usual times, they sell 40% of their revenue comes from the e-commerce side. They were getting about 20% of their total revenue that they used to get. And for them, at a time like this, it was pretty positive.
So Poppy Barley is getting help from the government. On top of getting a loan from Shopify Capital because they're a Shopify client, they also got the Canada Emergency Business Account loan of $40,000, but they still haven't heard back about the wage subsidy.
They know they qualify because they meet the terms, but they hadn't heard back on whether they actually are going to get the money and how much they were going to get. And, the third thing that Poppy Barley did was they used the rent relief program. They tried to use the rent relief program. They emailed their landlord, but they did not hear back from their landlord on whether the landlord would participate in the program. So For now, they're still actually paying full rent on 2 of their properties where they have their stores in malls.
Okay, and what about Imprint? How are they doing?
So Imprint has unfortunately not been doing so well. They've had to lay off a couple more of their employees. Their revenues have declined even more. Clients that they had who had promised them money for services they had done prior to the pandemic ended up canceling those contracts, and so they didn't even receive money that they were supposed to receive. So things aren't good for Imprint right now. They are worried. Again, they're still waiting to hear back about the wage subsidy. They have received the small business loan, but according to the owner, the small business loan doesn't take them very far. $40,000 can only do so much. And I think what they're most frustrated about is that they are all working from home, but they've had to continue paying rent on their open concept office space in downtown Toronto. And they've had no word on whether their landlord is going to apply for the rent relief program. The landlord has indicated that they're not very keen on applying for it. So that really worries them.
Okay. All right. So we'll come back to Imprint. And then what about Up Auto, the auto dealerships?
So Up Auto is in even more of a dire situation since I spoke to them in early March. The owner says things have gotten much worse. In the month of April alone, he lost more than 50% of his revenue. Keep in mind that in March, his revenue was down by only 15%, so that's a bigger drop. The biggest issue for him is that because he sells cars, his inventory is aging, and the depreciation rate on cars, is pretty high. Like, who's going to want to buy an early 2020 model in 2021 for the price that he wanted to sell it for when it was brand new? So he's struggling because he has inventory issues.
So Up Auto's also gotten a $40,000 loan from the government, but Vanmala says for a business this size, it's just a bit of a buffer. But the company's also applied for the wage subsidy.
He intends to bring back about 10 of his staff, but he is concerned that the wage subsidy program is going to be rolled back too early. The government has said they're going to extend it beyond June, but he says that the wage subsidy program should be extended for as long as is needed until things return to normal, which, we know is going to take a very long time.
We'll be right back. A couple of things I want to pick up on that you mentioned. So a common thread seems to be this delay with the wage subsidy program. So businesses are applying for it and they're not hearing back quickly enough, or they're still waiting to receive the money. What's going on there and why this delay?
It is a complicated program to dish out because you have to submit and be able to prove that you have this many employees earning this much money in the form of, all of your tax returns. So getting those documents together and having agents go through them at a scale which we're dealing with where, a vast number of businesses, probably 75% to 80% of businesses are applying for the wage subsidy. So right now, agents are dealing with evaluating a business, numerous employees within a business, including big businesses who have thousands of employees, and figuring out how to dispense this money. So I think the bureaucracy of that is slowing down the program.
Yeah.
And so we're in a situation where we are approaching mid-May, 9 to 10 weeks into this pandemic, and most businesses I've spoken to, the caveat being that a lot of the businesses I spoke to are small businesses, have not received the wage subsidy and are not able to rehire back their employees, which means that the unemployment rate continues to go up.
Okay, and you also mentioned Imprint is still waiting to hear from their landlord about whether or not they're going to get any rent relief. And you mentioned also that landlords seem to be kind of reluctant to use this rent relief program. And for a lot of small businesses, rent is their biggest cost. So why wouldn't landlords want to use this program? What have been the criticisms of it?
Right. So the idea behind the program was the onus is not only on the tenant to pay rent, it's on the landlord to give the tenant a discount. And from the point of view of a landlord, they are saying because the program is not compulsory, why should they provide a 25% discount for their tenants?
I think reasonable people should be working this out in a reasonable way. But as a landlord, you can appreciate that if you've got bills to pay, you may not be able to afford to extend 75% to your tenant.
So some landlords, especially bigger ones, might want to go down the route of litigation. So they might say, hey, nothing compels us to, involve ourselves in this program. We can actually just wait it out and potentially get the tenant evicted, potentially take this to court. So why would we then, out of our own volition, choose to participate in a program where we're discounting tenants? So the flaw in the program and the criticism of the program is that you're not forcing landlords to participate in it. So the other way to go about it is the government could say, hey, listen, we'll make sure somehow you don't lose your store by getting evicted because we'll take on the burden of paying for the rent. But the government chose not to do this. They came out with this kind of, mixed method approach of rent relief.
Now, across the country, there is talk of slowly lifting restrictions and coming out of the full economic shutdown. So here in Ontario, for example, now any business with a street-facing storefront can offer curbside pickup.
They will have to respect public health measures and the same workplace safety guidelines as well.
So once businesses are allowed to operate again, do you see the companies that you've been following bouncing back?
That's a great question. So I'll start with the car dealership because the dealerships are probably going to be one of the first businesses that are allowed to start opening. And, one of the biggest concerns is foot traffic. So are people actually going to come out and visit a dealership, first of all, given that, the virus is still around? And the second thing is, even if they do, are they going to have the financial capacity to make such a huge purchase right now, which is buying a car?
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of worry. Consumer confidence is at, probably the lowest it's been since the 2008 recession, or probably even lower. We don't have that data yet. And so for Michael Carmichael, the owner of Up Auto, he's concerned that it doesn't matter if his business is open, he's still going to suffer these massive revenue declines going forward. The secondary problem he's having is he's finding it difficult to convince his employees to come back to work because they are concerned about safety issues. He would have to procure PPE, masks, and gloves and all the protective equipment for his staff. And, he's redesigning his dealership such that staff maintain social distancing while they're working. Those things cost money for him, so keep that in mind. But even then, he tells me that, it's not easy to convince his employees to come back when they feel okay financially for now because they're receiving $2,000 off the government benefit every month. And I guess that's the interesting thing about the programs the government has dished out. So the idea behind CERB, $2,000 a month, was really to deter people from going to work. And that's a good thing to do, and that worked. And so now you have these programs like the wage subsidy that's encouraging people to come back by rehiring them. It's very complicated because that's the safety aspect to all of this. And for someone who is perhaps not making a lot of money, why would they choose to come back to work on maybe a slightly elevated income rather than collect $2,000 and stay back until things are safe?
Right. And the other thing is, it seems like at least a couple of the companies that you talked about their operations are dependent on other businesses also being up and running. So Imprint, for example, needs clients who have money to spend on marketing, and then Poppy they have a factory in Mexico. They need that factory to be up and running in order to get their stock, right?
Right. So one of the biggest problems with this recession, and the reason why economists think it's going to drag on for a while, is exactly what you just said. It's this ripple effect.
So there's a report that just came out from the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, and small businesses are worried about some of the stuff that you mentioned. So social distancing, understanding the rules, making customers feel safer.
And because we are a lingerie store, it's a little more intimate.
Her biggest challenge, getting customers back amid strict social distancing, constant cleansing, point of purchase plexiglass, and mandatory masks.
I've seen some calls for clearer guidelines from the government on this stuff. Have you been hearing that from the businesses that you've been talking to?
Absolutely. So I think one of the things that small businesses have been a little bit frustrated about is the talk around reopening has been going on for about 10 days now, and there hasn't been a very clear guideline on specifically what employers should be doing to make sure the employees feel safe beyond just things like wearing masks and gloves and maintaining 2-meter distances. But how do you do that? How do you actually kind of go about doing that? The employers need to convince staff that it's safe to go back. They need to refer to government guidelines that are out there that they can quote from and say, hey, look, we followed all of this, so you should come back to work. It's okay, it's safe. The government said so. And that's kind of not happening right now. So we're in this very kind of weird middle ground situation where businesses are waiting for more specific government guidelines and employees are waiting for their employers to provide them specific guidelines so that they trust that they can return to work.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem like any other country has really nailed how to reopen properly yet. Like we've seen Germany tried to reopen, South Korea tried to reopen, and then they saw these spikes.
In the Republic of Korea, bars and clubs were shut as a confirmed case led to many contacts being traced. Germany has also reported an increase in cases since an easing of restrictions.
We kind of face the prospect of another total shutdown if we reopen and we see another spike in cases. So it's not like even if businesses reopen, it's going to be a linear thing and things are just going to keep getting better. Like we could see this up and down for the next little while until we get a vaccine that's being widely distributed.
Absolutely. So, as you said that, I was thinking of an example of a hair salon in Toronto. This hair salon owner told me they are preparing to open up. They're figuring out how to kind of space out their stations, and they're spending money, even though they have zero revenue right now, they're spending money on getting lots of masks, lots of, personal protective equipment, but that costs money. Reopening costs money for businesses. And if you're going to have to keep doing this again and again, and even when you're open, your foot traffic is like maybe less than 50% of what it used to be, it warrants the question, should you even open up again? Is it more of a cost to open up?
Right. So this is not a situation where every business that has had to slow down or shut down because of the pandemic is going to easily recover once restrictions are lifted. And I'm just wondering, do you have any predictions for what's going to happen to the small business landscape in Canada, like long term?
I think one of the saddest things about what I've been seeing with small businesses in my reporting is that a lot of them tell me they might not be able to remain open for much longer. When I first spoke to them in March, they said they had a 2 to 3 month runway, to keep operating. We're now reaching the 2.5 month mark. And I think a lot of them are really worried that if they don't, as we discussed, get that consumer demand even back up to what it nearly used to be, it will be really difficult to justify keeping the operations open. And some of them might actually consider shutting temporarily. And then when this is over in a few years, figuring out, how to come back as either a different business or, rebrand completely. But who knows what that situation will look in 2 years from now and whether they can even afford to do that, because starting a business is a very expensive process.
Okay, Van, thank you so much. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how businesses adapt, and I want to bring you back to talk about that. But thank you so much for explaining all of this to us.
Thank you so much, Tamara, for having me.
All right, that's the show. Thanks so much for listening. And if you like this episode, do us a big favor. Please leave us a rating. This really helps other people find the show, and tell your friends. We really appreciate it. I'm Tamara Kendacker, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.